In the quiet corners of an animal shelter, a grief-stricken cat named Tommy kept crying, mourning the loss of its owner. The family members, burdened by their own grief, had reluctantly left him in the shelter, unaware of the heart-wrenching cries echoing in the lonely nights. One day, as the sympathetic vet read the tag on Tommy's collar, a look of shock crossed their face. How could Tommy's previous owners have missed this? Welcome to Wonderbot Animals. Dr. Greene wore his gloves as he slowly approached the corner where the cat was curled up. Coaxing it with treats, he knew he just had to get another look at that collar. As Tommy moved to take the treat, he read what it said again. "Oh my God," he muttered as he saw it, immediately calling over one of his assistants. Had he read that right? It wasn't just Tommy's owner's name that he had read, but something else as well. Mary, one of his veterinary assistants, ran into the room, alarm clear on her face. "What's wrong, Dr. Greene?" she asked, looking from him to Tommy, who was still curled up in the corner. "Yeah, it's just..." "Are you sure the woman who brought him here said his last name was Carter?" Scott asked Mary, her forehead creased into a frown. "Yeah, she was his wife. She said her name was Margaret, and his was Francis. Why'd you ask?" she said, inching closer, trying to find out why Scott was looking so confused before responding. "Because that's not on the tag." But whose name was on the collar? And more importantly, what could this imply about Tommy's true owner? Veterinarian Scott Greene's passion had always been animals. Ever since he was a young boy, he loved taking care of them, though he always hated the fact that they wouldn't live as long as he would. Now, he found that it was a much kinder fate. He was certain of it when Margaret Carter brought in her late husband's cat, Tommy, who seemed inconsolable with grief. The poor cat had only lost his owner a few days before, and according to the family members who had brought him to Scott, he wouldn't stop crying. The family seemed reluctant to leave him with Scott at first, but they knew there wasn't any other way. Tommy only ever listened to Francis, and with him gone, they had no clue how to handle him. "If we can, we will come back to get him," the older woman who had brought Tommy had said, while she was dabbing away the tears from her eyes. It was a heart-wrenching sight, but Scott understood why she did it. She wouldn't have the time to properly care for Tommy during her own grief. At least, that is why he thought she had brought him to the shelter. Dr. Scott Greene had taken Tommy to one of the kennels, letting it out of his carrier as soon as he found an empty one. The cat slowly got out, leaning against a wall as it remained crying. It was a sad sight, but he feared he couldn't do much about it. He quickly left the blanket in the carrier with Tommy before returning it to Miss Margaret. Dr. Scott felt bad leaving Tommy there, but he first had to finish the business with Miss Margaret. They signed the remaining forms so that Tommy's care was properly transferred to Dr. Scott. However, he had no clue about the hassle that would come with that in the future. If he had, he would have questioned Miss Margaret more about Tommy's past. First and foremost, Scott had never heard a cat cry and yowl this much. Though sadness from an animal that had only recently lost its owner was not atypical, this certainly was unlike anything he had ever experienced. "I'm going to check on Tommy," Scott said to Mary, his assistant, not yet having a clue what strange thing he would find. He found Tommy in the kennel, its paws against his face as Scott crouched down to see if anything could be amiss. He then noticed the collar that was still clasped around his neck. "It's time to take that off," Scott muttered to himself as he slowly and softly put his hand around the cat's neck to unclasp its collar, but then Tommy let out a loud screech. As soon as Scott touched the collar, Tommy seemed to be awoken from his depressed state. He jumped away with a loud screech before scurrying toward the corner of his cage. A loud hiss left Tommy as he curled up in a ball. Scott stood there startled, his hands partially in the air, afraid he might hurt Tommy. "Why won't you let me take off your collar?" Scott wondered aloud. He had also seen a quick glimpse of the tag, and he couldn't help but feel confused by it. "I must have seen it wrong," he muttered to himself. His eyes must have deceived him, as he could have sworn that he saw a different name on the tag than that of Margaret's late husband. Yet there was a more pressing matter now. Had Tommy been hurt without his knowledge? Scott inched closer, his voice soft, trying to calm the distressed cat. "Hey, Tommy, it's okay," he whispered, extending a hand slowly towards the collar. Tommy's eyes narrowed, and with a swift hiss, he swiped at Scott's hands, claws barely missing. Scott recoiled, realizing force wasn't the answer. This cat's trust wouldn't be won over by persistence alone, but through understanding and patience. Frustrated, but not defeated, Scott stood up, dusting off his pants. He needed a new strategy. Leaving the kennel, he pondered Tommy's behavior. It wasn't just grief. He was being territorial about something. With a new idea in mind, Scott headed towards the storage room, hoping a change in tactic might yield better results. Tommy's cries filled the room, but they softened as Scott re-entered, this time with a treat and a toy. "Let's try this again, buddy," Scott said, his tone light. He knew gaining Tommy's trust was crucial. Slowly, he placed the treat near the entrance and backed away, giving Tommy space. It was a waiting game now, and patience was key. Scott watched as Tommy, curiosity piqued, inched towards the treat. The cat's eyes flicked from Scott to the treat, gauging if it was safe. Finally, Tommy stretched out, sniffing cautiously before taking the treat. Scott remained still, a gentle smile on his face. This small victory felt like a breakthrough, a step towards understanding Tommy's guarded heart. As Tommy enjoyed the treat, Scott spoke softly, sharing stories of his own pets, hoping to forge a connection through his words. Gradually, Tommy uncurled, his posture relaxing. Scott knew the journey ahead would be long and filled with setbacks, but moments like these, where understanding began to bridge the gap between man and animal, fueled his determination to help Tommy heal. Scott tried again, this time more determined. Tommy, now slightly more at ease, still made it hard to get a good look at the collar. It dangled just out of view, Tommy's head tilting curiously as Scott maneuvered for a better angle. Frustration mingled with curiosity. What was so important about this collar that the cat became aggressive when he tried to take it? With a new strategy, Scott offered another treat, holding it just so that Tommy would lift his head. As Tommy reached up, Scott caught sight of the tag. His heart skipped a beat. "Oh my God," he whispered, disbelief coloring his voice. The name engraved on the metal wasn't what he expected. It was a revelation that would change everything. Scott didn't waste a moment. "Mary, could you come here, please?" His voice carried an urgency that had Mary rushing in. Her expression turned from concern to alarm at his tone. "What's wrong?" she asked, eyes darting from Scott to Tommy, sensing the tension. Scott was already piecing together a mystery that seemed to grow more complex by the second. "Mary, do you know Margaret's full name? And are we sure their last name was Carter?" Scott's questions came rapid fire, his mind racing with possibilities. Mary looked taken aback, confusion written all over her face. "I'll have to check the paperwork. Why? What's wrong?" she asked, curiosity piqued by Scott's intense focus. "That name isn't on the tag," Scott replied, his voice a mix of confusion and concern. Mary's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Not on the tag? Then, who?" She stopped, realizing the implications. "I'll check right now," she said, turning on her heel. The mystery of Tommy's real owner was unfolding, and the pieces were just beginning to come together. Scott tried really hard to make out the name on that worn-out collar, but it was like trying to read a message scratched into a school desk. Mostly impossible. It also didn't help that Tommy was moving around for the treat, and he couldn't get a clear view. Frustration was kicking in big time. It felt like this collar was the key to it all. Yat. He couldn't understand a word it said. Mary popped back in with a look that said she had news. Yep, they're Carters through and through. Names Margaret Elizabeth Carter. Mason and Francis Antonius Carter, she confirmed. Scott's brain did a somersault. How could the tag and what Mary said be so out of sync? It was like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. Something was off and nothing seemed to add up. Seeing Tommy all cozy and protective over his collar, Scott just couldn't bear to take it away from him. It was clear that collar meant the world to Tommy, like a kid with their favourite blanket. So, Scott backed off, deciding not to stir the pot. He closed Tommy's cage, hoping he would be all right alone. Regardless, he had bigger fish to fry anyway. Back at his desk, Scott turned detective, diving into Tommy's files like he was searching for buried treasure. Each visit to the clinic was a clue, leading him closer to the answer he so desperately sought. The address of the Carters was his next stop on this treasure hunt. Time to find out what was really buried there. With a mystery to solve, Scott knew he had to hit the road and get some answers face to face. Leaving Tommy behind, he set out for the Carters, feeling a bit like a detective in a TV show, minus the cool soundtrack. He was a man on a mission to crack the case without freaking Tommy out any more than necessary. Before dashing off, Scott caught Mary and Yara's attention. "Gonna step out for a bit," he said. "Ring me if anything pops up, all right?" They nodded, used to Scott's sudden dashes by now. With a final check to ensure everything was okay at the clinic, he headed out, feeling like he was about to unravel a big secret. Settling into his car, Scott punched in Miss Margaret's address into his GPS. The collar's mystery was like a puzzle piece stuck in his head, refusing to fit anywhere. As the car hummed to life, his thoughts were a jumble of what-ifs and maybes, all centered around that elusive tag. What was hidden beneath those scratches? As he drove, Scott's mind raced faster than his car. Why was the name on Tommy's tag scratched out? What secret was so big it had to be physically erased? His thoughts spiraled, imagining scenarios where Tommy had been part of something big, maybe even before Scott had come into his life. Each theory seemed wilder than the last. His foot got heavier on the pedal, urgency fueling his speed. Thinking about Tommy's age, Scott realised this cat had stories, years of untold adventures and secrets. The cat had to be around 10 years old, yet his records at the clinic weren't older than 6. The mystery of his past only deepened Scott's resolve. He had to know. He had to find out. Pulling up to the mansion felt surreal, like stepping into a storybook. The Carter mansion loomed, grand and silent, holding secrets within its walls. Scott parked, his heart thumping with a mix of nerves and excitement. He approached the front door, knocking with a determination fueled by the need to understand Tommy's past. The door creaked open, and there stood a woman, clearly not Margaret. Scott, a tad thrown off, quickly explained, "Hi, I'm here about Tommy, Margaret's cat. I really need to talk to her." His voice carried a mix of hope and urgency, hoping this stranger would understand the weirdness of his visit. "Oh, Mom's not here right now," the woman, revealing she was Margaret's daughter, said. Her tone was warm, despite the surprise visit. "But maybe I can help," she offered. Scott felt a bit awkward, thrown into this unexpected situation, but the offer was too good to refuse. Maybe this was the break he needed. Feeling out of his element, Scott hesitated before asking, "Could I look at some family photo books, maybe from around 6 years ago? I'm looking for something about Tommy." The request felt odd, even to him, but Jane didn't seem to mind. "Sure, that's an unusual ask, but let's see what we can find," she said, leading him inside. Jane excused herself to hunt down the albums, leaving Scott alone in the majestic entry hall. He couldn't help but look around, absorbing the grandeur and history of the place. His gaze wandered until it landed on a portrait of Frances, staring back at him. It felt like even the walls of this place held untold stories. Standing there, surrounded by the opulence of the Carter mansion, Scott felt a strange sense of connection to the past. It was as if stepping through that door had transported him into another world, one where every corner whispered secrets and every portrait had a story. He waited for Jane, wondering what the photo books might reveal about Tommy's mysterious past. Drawn to the photo, Scott couldn't help but move closer, observing a moment frozen in time. There they were, Margaret and Frances, with Tommy in a loving embrace that spoke volumes. It was a snapshot of happiness, Tommy's collar clear as day. Scott leaned in, hoping to decipher the enigma wrapped around Tommy's neck. As he studied the image, Tommy's demeanor in the photo struck him. The cat looked utterly content, basking in the love of his family. The collar, identical to the one he had struggled to read earlier, now lay before him in a still image. Without Tommy's wriggling, Scott could attempt to make out the scratched letters, his curiosity piquing. Even in the quiet of the mansion, the tag's secrets began to unravel, piece by piece. The letters Scott could make out didn't match up with either Francis or Margaret's names. This revelation deepened the mystery, pulling Scott further into the web of Tommy's past. What was the real story behind that collar? Lost in his thoughts, Scott jumped as the silence broke with the sound of Jane descending the stairs, a book clutched in her hands. Relief mixed with anticipation as he turned, wondering if the answers he sought were nestled within those pages Jane carried. She might just be carrying the question he had been asking himself this whole time. Jane halted her steps, her gaze fixed on Scott. "Why are you so interested in that picture?" she asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. Caught off guard, Scott had to think quickly. How much could he reveal without diving too deep into the mystery that brought him here? He wanted to think of a quick lie, but instead decided on something different, the truth. Scott, feeling a bit on the spot, went with the truth. "I'm just really caught up in Tommy's story, especially how he's been since losing Francis," he said, scratching his back. Jane's expression softened, a shadow of sadness crossing her face. Scott quickly added, "I'm really sorry for your loss too." It felt right to acknowledge her grief as well. Jane, perhaps comforted by Scott's sincerity, placed the photo book on a nearby table and walked closer to the picture. "My dad found Tommy after he was hit by a car. He was so scared, it took ages to calm him down," she shared, a nostalgic tone in her voice. Scott listened, captivated by the story of survival and care that had bound Tommy to this family. Scott's curiosity deepened. "Why didn't Francis just take Tommy to a vet?" he asked. Jane laughed softly. "Oh, he tried. But Tommy would panic at the slightest move toward the car, always running off to hide. It was easier to care for him at home." Scott nodded, understanding the dilemma. Tommy's fear had made the Carters his sanctuary. Jane's next words caught Scott off guard. "This all happened 6 years ago, and he's been with us ever since," she said, looking back at the photograph. Scott's mind raced. 6 years? The timeline added another layer to the enigma of Tommy's past. His theories, his guesses about the cat's life before the Carters, everything was getting more complicated and yet more fascinating. As soon as they flipped to a page featuring Tommy, Scott zeroed in on the familiar collar around the cat's neck. "Has Tommy always had this collar?" he inquired, hoping to unearth more about its origins. Jane's brow furrowed in thought before she nodded. "Yeah, he has." The confirmation piqued Scott's interest further, linking past and present with a simple piece of leather. Digging deeper, Scott ventured, "Do you remember anyone who might have owned Tommy before your family?" Jane's response was a quick shake of the head, her confusion clear. They continued turning pages, each photo a piece of Tommy's life with the Carters, yet none shedding light on the life he led before them. Then, they stumbled upon a portrait that stood out. In it, Tommy's tag was legible, untouched by the scratches that marred it now. Scott's heart skipped a beat. "Could I borrow this photo?" "It might help me figure out how to help Tommy," he explained, his voice tinged with hope. Jane hesitated only a moment before agreeing, entrusting Scott with the image under the promise of its return. With the photo in hand, Scott thanked Jane and hurried back to his car. His mind was ablaze with possibilities, the clear name on the tag a beacon guiding him toward a solution for Tommy's distress. He drove back to the clinic with urgency, eager to put his plan into action. The puzzle pieces were finally coming together, and Scott was determined to see it through for Tommy's sake. Arriving back at the clinic, Scott felt a rush of determination. The photo, now a key piece of evidence, could be the breakthrough he needed to understand Tommy's past and hopefully ease his heartache. With every mile closer, Scott's resolve hardened. He was on the cusp of uncovering the truth behind Tommy's territorial behaviour surrounding his collar. As soon as Scott walked into the clinic, Mary and Yara swarmed around, buzzing with questions. Without missing a beat, Scott spread the photo on the counter. "Check this out," he said, pointing to the clear name on the collar. He quickly filled them in on Tommy's story with the Carters and his theory that Tommy had another owner before all this unfolded. Scott explained his visit to the Carters, how Jane shared the story of Tommy's rescue, and the revelation from the photograph. "It says Emily Harrington here," he pointed out, suggesting that Tommy's attachment to the collar might stem from his time as a young cat with Emily. Mary and Yara leaned in closer, intrigued by the unfolding mystery. Turning to his computer, Scott typed in the name with a mix of hope and anticipation. A profile appeared, Emily Harrington living just one town over, fitting the timeline perfectly. It felt like the universe was finally starting to align the pieces of Tommy's past into a clearer picture. Scott didn't hesitate. He found a number and dialed, his heart thumping. Explaining the situation to Emily was tricky. He could hear her confusion over the phone. "I might need your help with a cat that possibly belonged to you," he said carefully. After a moment of silence, Emily agreed to come by, curiosity piqued by this unexpected call. As he hung up, Scott couldn't help but feel a whirlwind of emotions. Was he about to reunite Tommy with a long-lost owner? The clinic was abuzz with speculation and hope, Mary and Yara offering supportive smiles. The wait for Emily's arrival was filled with anticipation, each minute stretching longer as they imagined the reunion that could be moments away. Emily cautiously made her way into the clinic, uncertainty in every step. Scott, sensing her apprehension, quickly explained the situation, hoping to ease her into the unexpected scenario. Together, they approached Tommy's kennel, with Emily trailing slightly behind, as if unsure about the reality of the moment unfolding before her. Tommy's yowls ceased as Scott stepped in, turning a tense silence into an electric anticipation. Then, upon spotting Emily, Tommy's demeanour shifted. He hesitated, then slowly, with a kind of cautious curiosity, moved closer to her. It was a moment thick with possibility, watched in silent awe by everyone present. Emily offered her hand to Tommy, her movements tentative. But when Tommy sniffed her scent, recognition sparked. He headbutted her hand, his purring loud in the quiet room, signalling a reunion that felt both incredible and heartwarming. Emily, shocked and overjoyed, could barely contain her emotions at this sudden, beautiful acknowledgement of her by Tommy. With tears streaming down her face, Emily shared the heart-wrenching story of losing Tommy during a family move 6 years ago. Her words painted a picture of a frantic search, the pain of separation, and the eventual heavy-hearted acceptance of his loss. Scott listened, deeply moved by her attachment and the sheer fate that brought them back together. Their heartfelt reunion was abruptly paused by Yara's entrance. She announced that Margaret Carter was at the clinic, visibly upset about the photo Scott had taken. The atmosphere tensed, readying for the implications of Margaret's arrival and the delicate conversation that would surely follow, intertwining the past and present of Tommy's journey. Emily and Scott, with mixed feelings, approached the front where Margaret stood, her expression a complex mix of grief and confusion. As Emily and Margaret met, the air was initially charged with uncertainty. However, as they shared their stories, a surprising warmth blossomed between them. The conversation, filled with shared memories of Tommy, turned from awkward to heartwarming, bridging gaps between past and present. Emily, with a voice tinged with nostalgia, recounted how Tommy had been a beacon of joy in her childhood, lost in the turmoil of a move. Margaret, in turn, shared the story of discovery and care, painting a vivid picture of the day she and her late husband found Tommy. Their stories, woven together by Tommy's journey, created a tapestry of love and loss, connection and serendipity. The decision wasn't easy, but it was clear that Tommy had two families that loved him deeply. With thoughtful consideration, Emily and Margaret reached a heartening agreement. Tommy would have 2 homes shared between them. This decision, made from a place of love and mutual respect, underscored the profound bond Tommy had forged with both families. Margaret, reflecting on recent events and her husband's passing, expressed her desire to continue seeing Tommy after settling her affairs. Her words, filled with a mix of sorrow and hope, resonated with everyone present. It was a testament to the love she held for Tommy, a connection that transcended circumstance and grief. Emily, understanding and supportive, welcomed the arrangement, ready to reintegrate Tommy into her life while honouring his connection with Margaret. Scott watched the unfolding agreement with a sense of fulfilment, grateful for the role he had played in mending hearts and bringing about a resolution that felt like a true celebration of Tommy's incredible journey through life.